The air in the midnight club is thick with smoke and the sound of a saxophone. Junhyuk sits in his usual corner, in the shadows. From here, he can see the entire room, the whiskey-poured bar, the small tables, the stage. This is his territory, his calm, orderly kingdom, where everyone knows their place and the rules. He watches, as always. His gaze glides over the customers, noting familiar faces, checking that everything is in order. His assistant, Mr. Kim, stands nearby, quiet and attentive. Everything is proceeding as usual. The evening is like any other evening, and suddenly his gaze catches sight of something new. A girl sits at a table against the far wall. She's alone. That's what immediately catches your eye. But that's not all. She has skin as warm as autumn honey and voluminous black hair pulled back into a messy bun. She's dressed simply, a dark sweater and jeans, but she sits with such casual directness, as if this club is the most natural place in the world for her. Junhyuk leans back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the glass of his drink. Who is she? Not his type. Not the type of person who usually wanders here on business. She's listening to music, her eyes half closed, her lips touching the rim of a glass of something non-alcoholic, judging by the color. Juice, perhaps. And then this happens. Her friend, sitting at the next table, says something, gesturing. And the girl, she laughs. The sound cuts through the silence in Junhyuk's head with a clear, ringing note. It's unlike the subdued, businesslike chuckles he hears every day. It's lively, sincere, a little hoarse, and very loud. It drowns out the noise of the saxophone and the hubbub of voices. For a few seconds, several people turn around, but she doesn't notice or pays no attention. She simply laughs, throwing her head back, and her entire world seems to consist solely of this joke and the music. Junhyuk doesn't move. He just watches. This laughter strangely doesn't irritate him. On the contrary, it captivates him, like a ray of sunshine in his always gloomy world. He forgets to watch the entrance, the expressions on his people's faces. He watches the curve of her lips, the wrinkles around her eyes that appeared when she laughed. Mr. Kim, sensing the change in the atmosphere, gently approaches. Boss, everything all right? Junhyuk slowly turns his gaze to him. Who is it? His voice is even, but there is a slight stiffness in it. Mr. Kim glances quickly at the table. New girl, second time here this week. Chloe Edwards. Teaches English at a language school nearby. No connections. No history. Junhyuk nods, not taking his eyes off her. Chloe, the name fits. Not Korean. Foreign. Like herself here. Is she alone? Often. Sometimes with colleagues. Today alone, Mr. Kim quietly reports. The saxophone fades. A break begins. Chloe picks up her purse and gets ready to leave. As she passes his corner, she meets his gaze for a second. Her eyes are dark, intelligent, curious. She does not lower her gaze, does not quicken her step. She looks at him easily and openly, and the same hint of a smile plays at the corner of her lips. Then she looks away and steps out into the night. Junhyuk suddenly feels the air in the club become just air again, thick, smoky, and ordinary. Mr. Kim, he says, still looking at the now empty table. Yes, boss. This girl, Chloe, she has nothing to do with our affairs. I understand. Our affairs should not concern her, and our affairs should not concern her. None of our people approach her. Do not talk to her. Do not disturb her. She comes, listens to music, leaves, and we do not notice her, understand? His voice is firm, commanding. An order. Mr. Kim nods almost imperceptibly. Absolutely understandable, boss. She will be protected, but out of sight. And me too, Junhyuk adds, pouring himself some more water. I do not notice her. Yes, boss. But 3 days later, she comes again, and again alone. She sits at the same table, orders juice, listens to the music, and sometimes, when the musicians play especially well, she smiles. Not as loudly as that time, but that smile still seems to radiate light. Junhyuk, sitting in his corner, finds himself watching not the door, but the expression on her face. He looks away, angry with himself. He can't afford this. His life is a web of obligations, dangers, and old wounds. There is no room in it for someone else's sunlight. One evening, as she passes his desk on her way out, she doesn't just look at him. She pauses, just for a few seconds. They always have such great music here, she says simply, as if commenting on the weather. Her voice is low, pleasant. Junhyuk looks at her without answering. His face is an impenetrable mask. His insides tighten. He needs to keep his distance. Chloe isn't embarrassed. She just raises her eyebrows slightly, as if to say, oh well, and walks away. And on her next visit, when she pays the bill, she leaves more than just money on the table. A folded piece of paper from a notebook lies under her glass. The bartender, catching Junhyuk's eye, brings it to him. Junhyuk unfolds the sheet of paper. It's a drawing, a pencil sketch. He's in it, sitting in his corner. The lines are confident, vibrant. The artist has captured more than just features. He's captured the pose, the detachment, the very look with which Junhyuk observes the world from his shadow. But in the corner of the drawing, there's a small detail that doesn't exist in reality. A faint, barely hinted shadow of a smile at the corner of the drawn mouth. He sits for a long time, holding the piece of paper in his hands. Mr. Kim is silent next to him. Junhyuk looks at the portrait, at the added smile, and feels something stir in his chest, in the place he'd long considered calm and dead, something dangerous and completely inappropriate. He carefully folds the drawing and places it in his jacket's inside pocket, right above his heart. The ignore it or order still stands, but obeying it is becoming more and more difficult with each passing minute. The sheet of paper with the drawing burns in the pocket above his heart. Junhyuk feels it there all evening, like a secret seal. He sits in his corner, but sees neither the musicians nor the visitors. He sees the black, confident lines, and that treacherous smile the artist gave his paper double. His head is noisy, noisier than a saxophone. This simple piece of paper has stirred something that has lain heavy and unshakable for years. He thinks of her laughter, of her direct gaze, of how she said, "There's always such great music here. Not you or your place, just here." As if he were a part of this place, not its dark heart. And it hurts because he knows the truth. Late at night, when the club is empty, and the bartenders are wiping down the counters, Junhyuk goes up to his office on the second floor. It's quiet. He takes out the drawing, places it on the clean table, and sits down across from it. He looks at his drawn face. He can't be with her. The thought hits him with renewed force, cold and hard, like the truth. He remembers the white walls of the hospital, the smell of antiseptic that is seared into his memory forever. He was 20. An unsuccessful fight, a long recovery, and then the doctor's words, calm, merciless. The chances are practically non-existent. You must accept this. A diagnosis that erased any future with his family for him. He is not a father. He will never be one. First there was rage, then emptiness. Then he built his life around this emptiness. His business, his power, his cold calm, all of it grew out of this black hole inside. He forbade himself to even think about anything else, about a normal life, about home, about children's laughter in the kitchen. And her laughter was so alive tonight. He has no right to drag her into his complicated, dangerous life, knowing that in the end, he won't be able to give her what's most important. He won't be able to give her a family. She's like that, bright, open, straightforward. She needs everything. Sunshine, travel, the noisy company of friends, and then a quiet home and the voices of children. All he can give her is shade, money, and constant fear. He clenches his fists. The feeling that stirred in his chest at the sight of the drawing needs to be suppressed, now, before it's too late, for her own good. The next evening, Chloe comes again. Junhyuk watches her enter and throw off her light coat. His heart gives a stupid, treacherous jerk. He turns away, pretending to study the screen of his phone. She sits down at her table. He feels her presence with every cell of his skin, but he doesn't look in her direction. His entire being is focused on being stone, ice. An hour passes. The music flows. People talk. Junhyuk gives directions to Mr. Kim, nods to familiar customers. His gaze deliberately slides past her table. Once, out of the corner of his eye, he sees her looking at him. He immediately turns his gaze to the stage. When she gets up to leave, her route, as always, takes her past his corner. She slows her pace. He senses it. He looks up, not at her, but somewhere beyond her shoulder. His face is completely blank, indifferent. "Good evening," she says. Her voice is quieter than usual, with a questioning note. Junhyuk slowly, as if forcing himself, turns his gaze to her. He nods, once, curtly, and then immediately looks away again, at Mr. Kim, pretending to wait for the report. He acts as if she's an unfamiliar visitor who dared to distract him. Coldness radiates from him in waves. He sees the warmth drain from her eyes, her light, expectant smile fade. She pauses for a second, then nods sharply in response, clutches the strap of her purse, and quickly walks away. Junhyuk closes his eyes. Inside, everything is screaming, but he doesn't move. This goes on for a week. She comes. He pretends she's not there. He never looks at her for more than a second. He never responds to her quiet hellos. He builds a wall between them, high, thick, and very cold. He sees her confidence fading. How she first came with hope in her eyes, then with bewilderment, and now with a closed, hurt face. She lingers less and less, drinks her juice quickly, doesn't laugh. This hurts him even more, but he pushes this weakness away. It's better this way. It's right. And then one Wednesday evening, she doesn't just pass by. She stops right in front of his desk. Her shadow falls on his hands. Junhyuk slowly raises his head, ready for another attempt at politeness, which he will easily dismiss. But her face isn't polite, it's serious. Her eyes, usually so warm, now look at him directly and firmly. There's no fear in them, only pain and question. "Why?" she asks quietly, but so clearly that he can hear her over the music. He's silent. He looks at her, maintaining a mask of indifference, but inside he's trembling. "Did I do something? Say something wrong?" she continues, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. "Or is it just my very presence that bothers you? I thought, after that drawing." She doesn't finish, but he understands. She thought there was something between them. It had begun. Junhyuk sees the hurt in the depths of her eyes, hurt and wounded. It's the very same wound he wanted to prevent, but inflicted himself with his cruel disregard. He opens his mouth to say something harsh, final, something that will make her leave and never return, but the words won't come. They stick in his throat. He sees her waiting, hoping even now for some kind of explanation, any kind, and at that moment, his wall shows its first crack. The word "why" hangs in the air between them like a shard of glass. Junhyuk sees the hurt in her eyes. He sees her clutching the strap of her bag, bracing herself for another icy stare, for the silence that will make her turn and leave forever, and his wall collapses. It doesn't crack or crumble. It explodes from within under the pressure of everything he's held within, her laughter, her drawing, her direct gaze, and the unbearable pain of him hurting her. He doesn't think. He stands up. The table slides back with a soft thud. Shock flashes in Mr. Kim's eyes, standing 3 steps away, but Junhyuk doesn't see it. He sees only Chloe, her wide eyes, her lips slightly parted in surprise. He takes one step, then another, and closes the distance between them. His hands find her face on their own. His palms touch her warm cheeks, and the touch is like a breath of air after a long period of suffocation. He kisses her, right in the middle of a half-empty bar, to the muffled sounds of a double bass. This kiss is neither tender nor questioning. It is desperate. It contains all his silence over these weeks, all his struggle, all his secret longing. It is a sigh kiss, a confession kiss, a surrender kiss. He can no longer hide. He can no longer pretend. All his rules, his prohibitions, his ironclad logic, everything crumbles to dust in this second. Chloe freezes for a moment, stunned. Then her fingers curl into the fabric of his jacket, not to push him away, but to steady herself, to find purchase in this sudden storm. She kisses him back, hesitantly at first, then with the same intensity as he. When they finally break apart, the club is deathly silent. The musicians have stopped playing. The bartender stands frozen, glass in hand. Mr. Kim takes a few silent steps, shielding them from the curious gazes of the other patrons. Junhyuk doesn't pay attention. He looks only at her confused, shining eyes, at her reddened lips. "I'm sorry," he breathes out hoarsely. "I just couldn't do it anymore." She nods silently. She can't utter a word, but there's no longer any resentment in her gaze. There's shock, a question, and a blazing, bright hope. From this evening on, everything changes. But these changes are hidden from everyone. They don't go on regular dates. Instead, when the club closes, Junhyuk sometimes waits for her at the service exit in an alley. They silently climb into his discreet dark car and drive somewhere where no one knows him, to a 24-hour buckwheat noodle restaurant on the outskirts, to a park when it's completely dark and deserted. Sometimes he brings her back to his place, not to his main apartment, but to a small, inconspicuous one he keeps for emergencies. There's nothing personal there, just neutral furniture and large windows overlooking the city. He tells her his business is import-export, that he has competitors, so she needs to be careful. He's not lying, but he's not telling the truth either. He doesn't talk about the methods he sometimes has to use. He doesn't talk about the technical negotiations in back alleys. He hides a whole layer of his life from her, and the feeling of being visited only grows. But he's also hiding something else, a deepest secret, one that burrows deeper than any criminal record, that old diagnosis. The thought of it comes to him at night, when he lies awake, feeling her breath next to him. He clenches his teeth and pushes her away. Not now, he thinks. Later. I need to savor it while it lasts. Chloe seems to accept his rules. She doesn't pry. She laughs at his rare jokes, talks about her students, and funny incidents at school. She shows him photographs of her paintings, bright, abstract canvases, full of color and movement, so unlike anything around him. She teaches him simple phrases in English, and to his surprise, he memorizes them, just to hear her laugh again at his accent. These weeks are the strangest and brightest in Junhyuk's life. He lives as if in two worlds. During the day, he's the same, a cool and collected boss. He solves problems, gives orders, keeps everything under control. But somewhere in the back of his mind, the thought of her constantly lingers, that he might see her in the evening. It's like a quiet, warm light at the end of a dark tunnel. He forgets his worries when they're together, real heavy worries. He doesn't think about rival gangs, pressure from the authorities, or the constant tension. In her presence, the world shrinks to the size of the room, the sound of her voice, the taste of the tea she brews for him. She brings with her simple things, the scent of her shampoo, the brushes scattered on the table, the melody she hums to herself. One day, she falls asleep on the couch in his nondescript apartment, her head on his lap. He sits motionless for hours, afraid to disturb her, and simply watches the rise and fall of her chest with her breathing. In that moment, he feels a peace he hasn't experienced since he was an adult. He almost allows himself to believe that it can be like this forever, that he can shield this small island of light from the rest of the world. Almost. But in the mornings, when she leaves and he returns to his real office at the club, the shadow returns. Mr. Kim reports new problems. The enemy is active, and somewhere in the darkest corner of his memory, along with this report, another voice awakens, calm, clinical. The chances are practically non-existent, and this voice reminds him, all this happiness is temporary. It is built on sand. Sooner or later, the truth will emerge, and he will have to pay for these bright weeks with even greater pain. The peace didn't last long. One evening, as Junhyuk walked Chloe to a taxi on the corner of an alley, his gaze automatically slid across the rooftops and windows and caught on. Across the street, in the shadow of an entrance, stood a man. He was smoking and looking not at them, but somewhere off to the side. But his posture was too familiar, too tense for a simple passerby. Junhyuk's insides. He gently but firmly pushed Chloe toward the car that had already pulled up. "Hurry!" he said, and his voice carried that same commanding note he'd so carefully hidden from her. She looked at him in surprise, but obeyed. The door slammed shut. He didn't wait for the car to disappear from sight. He had already turned and was walking quickly back toward the club, giving quiet, clear instructions to Mr. Kim over the phone. His old life, dark and merciless, had just extended a cold hand to them and touched what was most precious to him. The next morning, he held a meeting, emotionless, as always. It turned out that the rival group he'd recently displaced from several profitable locations hadn't accepted defeat. They were looking for a weak spot, and it seemed they'd found it. Chloe was no secret to those who knew how to watch. Her visits to the club, their rare outings together, all of it left a mark. "Increase security," Junhyuk told his most trusted man, "around the clock. But make sure she doesn't notice. Never. If they sense we're panicking, it will only make her more vulnerable." He didn't say a word to Chloe. Why scare her? Why let this cold terror into their fragile world? He simply started calling her more often during the day, asking how she was doing. And in the evenings, when they met, his eyes constantly, unnoticeably, scanned the space around him. To somehow compensate for this hidden danger, he tried to let her deeper into his life, the normal part, and then Chloe decided to show him her world. "My friends want to see you," she said one day over dinner. "They think I made you up." Junhyuk felt his insides tighten. Friends. Loud, curious, straightforward people. Not his type. "I don't do well in that kind of company," he said carefully. "It's okay," she smiled. "They're ordinary. Artists. Teachers. They don't bite." He went into a small apartment, cluttered with paintings, smelling of paint and food. He felt awkward. He stood against the wall like a stranger, in his perfectly fitting dark suit. While around him, people laughed, argued about art, clapped each other on the back. He didn't know what to say. His jokes were too dry, his questions too businesslike. He felt like a bull in a china shop, but he tried. Because he saw Chloe beaming as she held his hand. Because he wanted to be part of this simple, warm world. He listened to the conversations, nodded, and even seemed to smile a couple of times. Later, she took him to a contemporary art exhibition. He didn't understand half of what he saw, but he watched her. He watched the way her eyes lit up when she explained the idea behind this or that work. And in that moment, his awkwardness melted. This was worth it. But in return, he had to show her his world. Or rather, the part of it that could be put on display. He couldn't invite her into his office at the club, where the reports on the desk weren't exactly about import-export. He couldn't show her the places where the real issues were decided. Instead, he took her to luxurious restaurants on the top floors of skyscrapers, where glass walls offered views of the entire illuminated city. He ordered the most exquisite dishes, the kind she'd only read about in magazines. He gave her expensive, yet exquisitely subtle and elegant gifts. Not flashy jewelry, but a silk scarf of an incredible color and an antique edition of her favorite poet. He created a beautiful fairy tale for her, a fairy tale of a powerful, successful man who could give her the world. He showed her the shiny, polished surface of his life, but he always led her along safe, well-lit streets. He never turned down dark alleys, even if it was a shortcut. If he saw a suspicious group of people along the way, or noticed a car that seemed to be following them for too long, he'd immediately change route, making up a plausible excuse on the fly. Let's stop at that cafe you mentioned. Or, I remembered there's road construction going on there. He hid the other side of his metal from her. The dim light of the lamps in the empty warehouses where meetings were held, the silent, tense faces of his people when something went wrong, the sharp, short phone calls that left his face stony for hours. He'd go into another room to answer them, or say briefly, "Business. Sorry," was her world, warm, bright, and a little confusing. The other was his reality, harsh, gray, and full of hidden threats. And somewhere between them, deep down, lay his deepest secret, the one he feared most to reveal. Because it was this secret that made this beautiful fairy tale he was constructing for her impossible in the long run. But for now, he simply basked in the light, desperately hoping that the shadows would never reach them both. The warning turned out to be more than just a shadow. The enemies decided to act. It happened on Wednesday. Chloe was leaving school after her last class. Two men in casual clothes approached her on the porch. They spoke politely, even respectfully, but their words made her blood run cold. "Tell your friend, Mr. L," one of them said, smiling dispassionately, "that it's dangerous to pry into other people's business, especially when there's such a beautiful flower waiting at home. Flowers break easily. Think of your health, Miss Edwards." They didn't touch her. They didn't raise their voices. They simply said it and left, disappearing into the crowd of students. Chloe stood leaning against the wall, feeling her legs buckle. A chilling, primal fear gripped her. She called Junhyuk. Her voice trembled. He listened silently, and even over the phone, she could feel the air around him turn icy on the other end of the line. "Where are you?" he asked in a flat, too flat voice. "At school. In my office. Don't go out. They're already on their way to you. They'll stay with you until I get there myself." He appeared 20 minutes later. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with a dark, absolute fire. He hugged her tightly, almost painfully, and she felt his entire body tense like a string. "It's okay," he murmured into her hair. "Everything will be okay." But that was only the beginning. She stumbled upon his solution to the problem by chance. Junhyuk thought she was sleeping in the bedroom of his spare apartment, but Chloe woke from a nightmare and went out to get a drink of water. The light was on in the living room. The door to the small study was ajar, and she saw him. He stood with his back to her, by the window, talking on a video call on a large screen. On the screen was the face of a frightened, battered man, one of the two who had approached her outside the school. Junhyuk spoke quietly, almost in a whisper, but each word fell like sharpened steel. "You approached her. You said those words to her." His voice was terrifying in its calm. "Now your words will come back to you. You will never approach anyone again. Not women, not children, not dogs on the street, because you will have neither the legs to approach nor the tongue to speak. Understand?" He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He simply pronounced the verdict. And there was something in his posture, in that quiet, absolute authority, that took Chloe's breath away. This wasn't the man she knew. This was someone else, powerful, merciless, and terrifying. She pulled away quietly, without making a sound, and returned to the bedroom, where she sat on the bed, hugging herself. She was shaking, from horror, from realization. She wasn't just next to a man from a complex world. She was next to its center, to its darkest power. When he entered the bedroom later, his face was familiar again, tired, but she looked at him with different eyes. "You weren't sleeping?" he asked. "I saw," she breathed out. "I saw you talking to that man." He froze, his whole body tensed. "Chloe!" "What was that, June?" Her voice trembled. "You promised him. You said, so who are you really?" He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He was silent for a long time. "It was the one who scared you," he finally said dully. "And what? Were you going to do with him what you promised?" "I made sure he and his friends would forget the way to you forever," he answered, not looking at her, "so that no one would ever look at you askance again. Yes, my methods are not what you're used to. My dealings are not exactly legal, Chloe. I told you. Import-export? Yes, of course. You're a mafioso," she whispered. The word hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. "I'm a man who has enemies and who must protect what's his," he said sharply, looking up at her. There was pain and fury in his eyes. "And you're mine now. Do you think I can let someone threaten you? Do you think there's time for polite conversations and the police? I'm my police! She pulled back. He saw the movement, and his face twisted in pain. I love you, he breathed out, and it sounded like an admission of defeat. That's the only truth I'm sure of. Everything else, my life, it's complicated, dark. There are things I can't tell you, not because I don't trust you, but because I want to protect you. Because if you knew everything, that light in your eyes that I love so much, it would go out, or you would leave yourself. They argued. Their voices rose. She cried from fear and disappointment. He screamed in frustration and rage that the world wasn't as she saw it, that sometimes cruelty was the only language wolves understood. He hadn't told her the most important thing, that he would never have children. This secret now seemed so insignificant compared to the one that had just been revealed. Chloe left that night. He didn't stop her. He sat in the empty apartment and felt everything he'd worked so hard to build crumble. The days dragged on painfully slowly. He didn't call. He gave her space. He almost lost hope. And then, a week later, she came to the club herself, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but with a firm gaze. She sat at his table in the shadows. I'm not saying I accept your methods, she said quietly. They horrify me, but I believe you love me, and I know how I feel about you. I saw your fear for me, real fear, and I've decided. I'm staying, but no new secrets, June. No more surprises. He couldn't believe his ears. He took her hand and pressed it to his forehead, feeling something heavy and dark inside him crack, giving way to a weak, trembling light of hope. He had another chance, but the price of that chance was living with the constant knowledge that she now saw the monster in him, and that his worst secret was still to come. After that argument, a new tension hung between them. It was subtler than before, but deeper. Chloe had said she was staying, but her eyes looked at him differently now. Not with the same blind trust, but with caution, with questioning. She had seen his dark side and accepted it, but that knowledge didn't disappear, and it gave rise to new suspicions. Junhyuk began to fall silent more often in the middle of conversations, withdrawing into himself. His phone calls became even briefer and more cryptic. Sometimes he would suddenly cancel their meetings, saying, urgent business. I can't. But there was something else in his voice, not just business-like concern, something akin to pain. Chloe began to speculate, and her imagination, fueled by fear and mistrust, conjured up the most terrifying images, that these weren't just affairs, that he had another life, another woman, perhaps even a family, a wife, children somewhere in a quiet suburb whom he had to care for. This would explain his secrecy, his gloomy mood, his constant sense of guilt. The thought burned her inside. She caught herself checking his clothes for foreign scents, eavesdropping on his phone conversations, trying to catch a woman's voice in the background. One day she asked point blank, June, are you sure you're alone? You don't have other commitments? He looked at her with such genuine surprise and horror that for a second she felt ashamed. No one but you, he said firmly. It's a vow. But even that vow couldn't dispel the shadow that had fallen between them. He was hiding something, and she could feel it in her skin. And Junhyuk was hiding exactly what she'd assumed. Other commitments, but not to another woman. To herself. He saw her tense, how she flinched at the unexpected call, how her eyes grew wary when he abruptly changed the subject. And his solution to the problem with those people had had its consequences. The enemies were hiding, but they hadn't disappeared. His people reported increased attention to Chloe's house, to her school. He had tightened security to the limit, but it was an arms race he couldn't win forever. One night, looking at her sleeping, he realized he wasn't protecting her. He was holding her in the eye of the storm. His love was a target on her back. As long as she was with him, she would never be safe. His world, his shadow, would always hang over her sunny life. The old diagnosis seemed irrelevant. Now the question was her physical safety. His heart was breaking, but his mind, hardened by years of tough decisions, delivered its verdict. He had to leave. He had to sever this connection, to remove the danger from her, to give her a chance at a normal, peaceful life. Without him, it was the worst, most painful decision of his life. But he saw it as the only right one. He chose their small apartment as the place for their conversation. He braced himself. Inside, everything was empty and cold. He pulled on his old skin, the skin of a ruthless boss who knows no weaknesses. Chloe arrived, cheerfully telling him about her day. She immediately sensed the atmosphere. Did something happen? She asked, the smile fading from her face. Sit down, he said evenly, not looking at her. He stood by the window, his back to her. It was easier that way. June, you're scaring me. "It's over, Chloe," he blurted out, his voice sounding alien, metallic. "Our relationship. It was a mistake." He heard her inhale sharply. Silence fell over the room. What are you saying? You heard. This isn't working. You're from another world. You don't fit into my life. It's become a burden. The constant precautions. Your fears. I'm tired of it. He fired words like bullets, each one more painful than the last. He spoke of incompatibility, of how she was too complicated for him with his normality. He tried to be rude, cold and distant. "So, all this time, I was a burden?" Her voice trembled. He clenched his fists behind his back. "Let's not overreact. It's just over. Take your things and go." He turned, ready to see anger, hurt pride, anything that would allow him to stand. But he saw her face. It wasn't angry. It was broken. Utterly broken. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks in thick drops. Her eyes held no anger, but genuine, absolute bewilderment, and a pain so deep it took his breath away. She looked at him the way one looks at a man who has suddenly stabbed him in the back. She couldn't believe her ears. And in that disbelief, in that wound, there was so much love and trust, betrayed so cruelly that his wall crumbled in an instant. He couldn't stand that look. All his cold resolve, all his iron logic crumbled to dust. He couldn't hurt her like that. He couldn't become the monster that was ruining her life. "No," he breathed out hoarsely, his own voice betraying a tremor. "No, that's not true." He took a step toward her, then another, and fell to his knees in front of the sofa where she sat, huddled. "I'm sorry," he said, his words slurring and flowing. "It's not true. You're not a burden. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm so afraid for you. I can see how afraid you are, and I think that if I leave, you'll be safer. But I can't. Seeing your face and saying those words, I can't," he cried. For the first time in years, quietly, without a sound, but tears streamed down his cheeks and fell onto her lap. He grabbed her hands, pressed them to his forehead, repeating, "I'm sorry," over and over again. Chloe didn't move at first, still in shock. Then her fingers trembled and weakly closed in his hair. She said nothing. She simply sat and cried with him, stroking his head as his body shook with the silent sobs of a man who had attempted self-sacrifice and broken halfway through, the force of his emotions overcoming any rational decision. That evening in the small apartment was a turning point. After the tears, after that terrible, failed attempt to break everything, there was silence. Not awkward, but somehow cathartic. They sat on the floor, their backs against the sofa, his head resting on her shoulder. No one spoke. Words were unnecessary. His breakdown, his tears, spoke to her more than any vows. He loved her so much that he was ready to make the greatest sacrifice of all, to give her up, and that sacrifice proved beyond his strength. They didn't make peace overnight. It was a process, slow and careful. Chloe didn't ask about his affairs anymore. She simply said, "I don't accept your methods, but I accept you, and your pain, and your fear for me. But don't ever try to decide for me what's best for me again. If we're together against everything. Understood?" He nodded, unable to speak. Their relationship became different after that, more honest, but also more fragile, and at the same time, stronger. Like trees that had bent to the ground after a storm, straightening up, their roots sinking deeper into the soil. Junhyuk stopped pretending to be an impenetrable rock. He allowed her to see his weariness, his anxiety. Sometimes he simply held her hand silently, and that was enough. He made a decision. He would fight, not only against external threats, but against himself. He would build some kind of future for them both. Despite his old demons, despite the dangers, he no longer ran. He chose to stand and protect what was most precious to him, and a strange, quiet time ensued. It was as if life itself was giving them a respite. The hostile group, frightened by his harsh reaction, lay low. No new threats came. His affairs proceeded smoothly, without any major upheavals. They lived those weeks as if in a golden bubble. Junhyuk almost stopped using the spare apartment. He began spending more nights at her place, in her cozy, sunlit apartment filled with paintings and books. He learned to live in this space, not to place his shoes perfectly straight by the entrance, to tolerate her brushes lying everywhere, to make her tea in the morning while she slept. He took her to the movies during matinees, when there weren't many people around. They strolled through large, crowded parks where it was easy to get lost, and for the first time in years, he felt like a normal person on a stroll with the girl he loved. He even met a couple of her close friends, those same artists, and this time, he felt less self-conscious. He listened silently to their conversations, and sometimes he even found himself interested. It was a calm, a genuine, profound one. It felt like the storm had passed, like they'd found their haven, Junhyuk almost believed it. He almost allowed himself to forget the main long-standing crack in the foundation of this happiness, that diagnosis. In this new, warm world, it began to seem unimportant, that they could be happy together anyway. He brushed away thoughts of it like pesky flies. Later, he thought, someday later, I'll tell her. One evening, they were cooking dinner together. Or rather, she was cooking, and he was clumsily chopping vegetables, trying not to cut off his finger. The kitchen smelled of spices and her perfume. Music was playing. Everything was perfect. Chloe suddenly turned off the water and turned to face him. There was a strange expression on her face, a mixture of delight, excitement, and a hint of apprehension. June, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. He put the knife down, wiped his hands, and smiled. He waited for her to say something like, let's get a cat, or, I want to go to the seaside. We're having a baby, she breathed, and her eyes shone with such pure, dazzling happiness that for a second he was blinded. The words didn't immediately reach his consciousness. They hung in the air, beautiful and impossible. What? He asked dully, not believing his ears. I'm pregnant, she repeated, and her smile grew even wider. She took his hands and pressed them to her still flat stomach. Our baby. I took a test, and another one. Everything was confirmed. She looked at him, expecting him to pick her up, spin her around, laugh, kiss her, expecting to share this joy with him, but the world around Junhyuk didn't explode with happiness. It collapsed. Everything inside him froze, and then shrank into a tight, icy lump. He couldn't feel her hands. He couldn't hear the music. He heard only the echo of the old, merciless voice in his head. The chances are practically non-existent. You have to accept it. He jerked his hands from hers as if from fire. His face, so relaxed and smiling just a moment ago, became a stony mask. His eyes, which had shone with calm a second ago, now flashed with a storm of disbelief, shock, and such a black, all-consuming pain that Chloe recoiled. What's wrong with you? She whispered, her radiance fading, replaced by confusion and fear. Junhyuk didn't answer. He looked at her but didn't see her. He saw only betrayal. His own body, which turned out to be not what he thought it was. No, there was only one logical, terrible explanation. The very thought that had tormented her before now pierced him. He took a step back, distancing himself from her, from this happiness that had suddenly turned to poison. This is not my child, he forced out. His voice was hoarse, alien. The silence that followed these words was louder than any scream. The words, our baby, hung in the air, warm and glowing like holiday lights. And that light struck Junhyuk right in the heart, not warming it, but scorching it to the core. Everything inside him snapped. Literally, it was as if someone had suddenly plucked the string that held his peace, his hope, his new, fragile faith in happiness. The sound was almost audible, a dull internal click. His face didn't contort in pain. It simply froze. All the life, all the warmth drained from him, leaving an empty, stony mask. The eyes that had just tenderly followed her movements became flat, impenetrable, like dark glass. He stopped breathing. It seemed even his heart had stopped beating. An icy wind howled inside his mind, carrying fragments of a single phrase, carved into the walls of his memory many years ago. You will never have children. Accept it. These words were his cross, his prison, his justification for all his rejections of a normal life. They were the absolute truth, and truth cannot lie. So she was lying. The thought pierced him like a cold needle. Her shining eyes, her hand pressed to her stomach, her expectation of happiness, all of it suddenly turned into a monstrous, unbearable lie. His body, which he thought was broken, couldn't perform such a miracle. It couldn't. The doctors said so, and doctors don't make mistakes. This is not my child. The words burst from him, quiet but sharp as a blade. They hung in the kitchen, cutting the festive atmosphere to shreds. And in that same second, he realized what he had done. He saw her eyes, those shining, loving eyes, widen in confusion, and then fill with such shock, such sharp, pure suffering, that he wanted to rip out his tongue. He immediately regretted it, more than he'd ever regretted anything in his life. He saw her face turn white, as if all the blood had been drained from it. He saw her lips tremble. He saw the light in her eyes fade, giving way first to incredible pain, and then to a chilling resentment. It was a mistake, a monstrous, unforgivable mistake, but it was too late. The words, like poisoned arrows, had already pierced her. Chloe didn't scream. She didn't attack him with her fists. She simply stood there, looking at him, seemingly slowly disintegrating before his eyes. Tears that might have just been tears of happiness now flowed silently down her face, leaving wet trails on her pale skin. What? What did you say? Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with genuine horror. Junhyuk opened his mouth to take back his words, to explain, to scream that he'd lost his mind. But there was a lump in his throat. The ice that gripped him from within prevented him from making a sound. He could only watch as he inflicted the most terrible wound on her. Chloe slowly shook her head, as if shaking off a nightmare. The insult his words inflicted was so deep, so humiliating, that even the air around her seemed to change. Her gaze was filled with nothing but pain and bitter contempt. She didn't wait for an explanation anymore. She didn't try to prove anything. She simply turned and walked away, slowly, hesitantly, holding onto the chair, as if her legs wouldn't obey her. "Chloe!" he finally squeezed out, taking a step forward, but she was already in the hallway. He heard her rip her light coat from the hanger without even putting it on. Then the sound of the door opening and slamming. Not slamming, just slamming. And that quiet, final sound rang in his ears, louder than any scream, louder than any gunshot. He was left standing in the middle of the kitchen, which still smelled of half-eaten dinner and the happiness that had been there just 5 minutes ago. Half-chopped vegetables lay on the table. Water dripped from the faucet. Everything was as it had been, only it was gone. And inside him now, there was more than just emptiness. There was an icy desert, in which the wind howled 3 words, "Not my child," and shame, such all-consuming, such a searing shame, that he grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. He had just lost everything, and through his own stupid, cruel fault. The next days passed in a blur. Junhyuk existed, not lived. He canceled all appointments, and didn't answer calls. Mr. and Kim, realizing something beyond the ordinary had happened, silently brought him food, which remained untouched. Junhyuk sat in the dark in his office at the club, or in an empty, unfamiliar apartment. His head was filled with the same sounds, his words, her face, her tears. And beneath them, the old rusty nail of a diagnosis, which now pierced him with renewed vigor, causing unbearable pain. He tried calling her, hundreds of times. She didn't pick up. He wrote messages, long, rambling, full of despair and apologies. Silence. He drove to her house, sat for hours in the car across the street, hoping to see a light in the window, a fleeting shadow, but there was none, or she never came out. He thought he had lost her forever, and this thought was worse than any sentence, worse than any physical pain. On the 3rd day, she appeared. He was at the club during the day, when the place was empty. He heard footsteps, and looked up. Chloe was standing in the doorway. She looked terrible, pale, with huge circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in a long time. She was wearing the same sweater she'd been wearing in the kitchen. She was clutching her bag. Junhyuk's heart sank, then started pounding. He jumped up. "Chloe?" he began, but the words caught in his throat. She didn't meet his eyes. Her gaze was downcast, her face closed and empty. She silently approached his desk, opened her bag, and pulled out not an ordinary piece of paper, but a folded form with official seals. She placed it in front of him on the polished wooden surface. Her finger lingered on the paper for a moment, as if it was hard for her to part with it. Then she turned abruptly and walked toward the exit. "Wait!" he shouted, but she had already disappeared behind the door. Junhyuk stared at the piece of paper. His hands were shaking. He unfolded it. It was the results of a prenatal DNA test. Dry, medical jargon. Numbers, graphs. His eyes skimmed the lines, not making sense, until they landed on the most important line. There, in bold print, was printed, probability of paternity, 99.99%. And below it, his name, Lee Junhyuk, the father. He read it once, then again, and again. The world around him turned upside down. It began to sound again, to move, but not as before, somehow different. The doctor's words, which he carried within himself as the ultimate truth, suddenly crumbled to dust before this simple piece of paper with a seal. He's a father. He's having a baby. His baby. Chloe didn't lie. She didn't cheat. She brought him a miracle. And he called her a liar and a traitor. He sat, staring at this paper, unable to move. The shock was so complete that it overwhelmed all other feelings. There was no joy. There was something greater and more terrible, a kind of cosmic bewilderment. How? How is this possible? The diagnosis. The doctors had said. They had said never. That word left no room for doubt. It was final, and this paper was even more final. So, had the doctors been wrong? Or had there always been a chance? Tiny, insignificant, practically non-existent? He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to comprehend it. He lived for almost 20 years, believing himself broken, inadequate in the most fundamental ways. He built his life, his relationships, pushing away love, relying on this truth. He tormented Chloe, tormented himself, trying to isolate himself from her, because he was certain he couldn't give her a future. And that future, it turns out, was always possible. He just forbade himself to believe in it. The thought was unbearable. It made him want to scream or cry, but there were no tears, only a huge, crushing void, now filled with a new, incredible fact. He would be a father. He didn't remember how he'd found his old contacts, how he'd gotten his men to track down the same doctor who'd treated him 20 years ago. The doctor was already retired and living outside the city. Junhyuk had come to see him that evening, unannounced. The old man recognized him, though he was surprised. He invited him into his modest, cozy home. "Lee Junhyuk," the doctor said, shaking his head. "I remember your case. The injury was serious." "You said I would never have children," Junhyuk managed to say, not sitting down. "You used that word. Never." The doctor paused, looking at his haggard, tense face. "I said the probability was extremely low," he corrected softly, "almost negligible. In medicine, they rarely say never, but for a young man who's experienced such trauma, sometimes toughness is needed to accept the situation and move on without being tormented by false hope." "False hope?" Junhyuk pulled the folded test results from his inside pocket and handed them to the doctor. "My girlfriend is pregnant. I'm the father." The doctor took the paper and put on his glasses. He read for a long time. Then he took them off and looked at Junhyuk. There was no surprise in his eyes. There was a kind of sad wisdom. "Congratulations," he said simply. "A miracle. Such things happen sometimes. 1 chance in a million. You caught him. Why didn't you tell me back then that there was a chance?" Junhyuk's voice broke into a whisper, full of pain and anger. "What would have changed?" the doctor asked quietly. "Would you have waited 20 years for this one chance? Or would you have built your life the way you did? Sometimes people need certainty, even bad ones, to live with what they have. You accepted that diagnosis as a death sentence, and you stopped hoping. And hoping, young man, can sometimes be the most painful thing of all." Junhyuk stood, listening to these words, and felt the last ground beneath his feet crumble. The doctor hadn't been wrong. He'd simply given him the truth Junhyuk was ready to hear, and Junhyuk seized upon it, making it his shield and his prison. He'd forbidden himself hope. He'd closed the door to a future that, it turned out, was possible, and he'd nearly destroyed it with his disbelief, his monstrous mistake. He left the doctor's office, and the world around him seemed alien, unreal. The solid ground on which he had stood his entire adult life turned out to be an illusion. He wasn't infertile. He was a father. He had built a wall of fear and pride on a lie, and for that wall, he almost lost everything. All his calm, all his strength, all that iron restraint for which he was respected and feared were gone, disappeared like smoke. All that remained was the naked, trembling truth and the crushing pain of what he had done. He didn't go to the club. He got in the car and drove to her. On the way, he started shaking. First, a slight tremor in his hands. Then his whole body began to shake, as if he were in a fever. He could barely hold the steering wheel. The tears that hadn't been there in the doctor's office now welled up in his throat, burning and uncontrollable. He parked outside her house, barely remembering how he got there. He got out of the car, his legs barely holding him up. He climbed the stairs, leaning against the walls. Outside her door, he paused for a second, gathering his courage. But there was no courage. There was only emptiness and despair. He knocked, softly at first, then louder. There was no sound from inside. Panic gripped his throat. He began pounding with his palm, no longer holding back. "Chloe, please, open up!" The lock clicked. The door swung open slightly, latched by the chain. Through the crack, he saw her face. Tired, devastated, her eyes red from tears. There was no longer that icy resentment in her gaze, only endless weariness and deep sadness. Seeing him, she didn't slam the door, but she didn't undo the chain either. "What do you want?" Her voice was lifeless. Junhyuk couldn't take it anymore. Everything he'd intended to say, an apology, an explanation, got stuck. Instead, tears streamed down his face. Loud, uncontrollable sobs erupted. He made no attempt to hold them back. He grabbed the doorframe to steady himself and slid to his knees, right on the threshold of her apartment. "I'm sorry," he wheezed through sobs, pressing his forehead against the cold wooden door. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." He couldn't speak. He could only cry. Cry like he hadn't cried since childhood, from shame, from regret, from the realization of the full depth of his mistake, from the happiness that had been so close, and which he had so cruelly pushed away. Chloe looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes. Cruelty and resentment couldn't withstand this absolute collapse, this sight of a strong, always in control man sobbing at her feet, broken into dust. Slowly, without a word, she closed the door. For a second, He thought it was all over, but then he heard the chain being removed. The door swung open completely. He didn't move. He didn't raise his head. He was afraid it was a dream. "Come in," she said quietly. "You can't do this. In front of everyone." He entered unsteadily. She silently pointed him to the sofa. She sat down in the armchair opposite him, her legs tucked under her, her arms wrapped around herself. A protective pose. There was a gulf between them. "Speak," she said, without anger, but without warmth either. And he began to speak. At first, with difficulty, stumbling, then the words flowed like a torrent. He told her everything. About that long-ago trauma, about the white walls of the hospital, about the doctor's words, which he took as a final sentence. "You will never be a father." He told her how that phrase broke something inside him, how he decided he had no right to a family, to normal love. Why condemn a woman to a life with a flawed man? "That's why I pushed you away," he said, looking at the floor. "From the very beginning. When you left the drawing, I was so scared, because you were exactly what I could have dreamed of, and I knew I couldn't give you a future. I thought I was protecting you from myself." He told me how every time they were happy, this thought lurked in the back of his mind, that it was all temporary, that sooner or later she would want children, and he would have to either lie or lose her. He lived in constant fear that his defect would be revealed. And when you said something about a child, everything in my head snapped. It was impossible for me. So only one thing is possible. Oh, Diol, that this isn't my child. And I said that monstrous thing. I caused you so much pain. His voice broke again. "I'm sorry. I have no excuses. Only fear. The stupid, childish fear of a broken person." He fell silent. The room was quiet. Chloe didn't move. She looked at him, quiet tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of resentment now. These were tears of understanding, a complex, bitter understanding. She was silent for a long time, digesting everything she had heard. He sat, not daring to move, awaiting the verdict. "You're completely out of your mind," she finally said, and there was no malice in her voice, only a tired bitterness. "A complete, utter lunatic." He nodded, agreeing. "Why didn't you tell me right away? At the very beginning. We could have, I don't know, take tests, find out the truth together." "I was afraid," he whispered. "Afraid you'd see me not as a man, but as an invalid, and leave. And then I just got used to living with this lie. It became a part of me. I believed it myself." Chloe sighed. The resentment, burning and sharp, that had kept her awake all these days, was now gradually receding, giving way to another pain. Pain for him, for this strong, powerful man, who had carried such a wound within himself for 20 years, and was so ashamed of it that he preferred to appear callous and cruel, but not ineffectual. She understood him. She understood this fear of being inferior, but understanding didn't erase the betrayal. His words in the kitchen, "Not my child," were still there. They would forever remain a scar on her soul, a scar on trust. "I forgive you for your fear," she said quietly, "and for your pain. I even understand why you did it, but I can't just forget. What you said, it hurt me too deeply. I believed you could think such a terrible thing about me." She looked at him straight, determination in her eyes. "I want this baby, and I know it's yours. But we need time, June. I can't just go back to the way things were. Trust needs to be earned again, and I don't know if you can, or if I can." Time wasn't just a word. It was a suspended sentence and hard work. Junhyuk accepted it without question. He began to change immediately. Not loudly, not ostentatiously, but with a quiet, iron determination. He began to distance himself from his old ways. Now he saw them not as a source of strength, but as the main threat to the future he was prepared to fight for. He entrusted Mr. Kim with most of the day-to-day operations. He focused on the legitimate side of the business, the jazz club, and the chain of small cafes he owned. He began exploring markets he'd previously avoided, looking for opportunities for pure investment. It was difficult. He felt like a newcomer in a strange world, but every time he felt discouraged, he remembered her words. Trust must be earned again. And her eyes, and the tiny life growing inside her. He didn't try to shower Chloe with gifts or obsessive attention. He simply was there, but in a different way. He'd come to her and silently cook dinner if she was tired. He took her to all her doctor's appointments, asked questions, listened attentively to the answers, and wrote everything down in a notebook. He read pregnancy books, shyly at first, then with increasing confidence. He rented a large, bright apartment for her and their future child in a quiet neighborhood with a park nearby. Without unnecessary luxury, but with a sense of security and peace. He didn't talk about love. He showed it, With every action, he proved he was ready to move mountains and change himself for them, for her and their child. He built the foundation of a new, pure life, brick by brick. But the old world wouldn't let him go so easily. The shadow of his past still loomed over them. He knew that as long as he remained even slightly involved in dark deeds, Chloe and the child would never be completely safe. The threats could return at any moment. And then he made the most difficult business decision of his life. He made a deal. Not with his enemies, but with the law. Through trusted intermediaries, he contacted prosecutors who had long been interested in the affairs of his former competitors and certain shady schemes he had once been involved in. The meeting was tense and frosty. Junhyuk didn't ask for immunity for himself. He asked only one thing: complete immunity for Chloe Edwards and their unborn child, that their names would never appear in any documents, that they would remain out of all this. In exchange, he offered information, structured, clear, and backed by evidence. Information that could help close several high-profile cases and neutralize those who were a real headache for the authorities. He agreed to be a witness, but only anonymously, and only in exchange for ironclad guarantees for his family. It was a huge sacrifice. He was betraying old, albeit warped, notions. He risked revenge from those he had turned in, but he did so with a light heart, because it was the price for their peace of mind, the price for the right to look his child in the eye. He signed the papers, knowing he was burning bridges with his past, and in that moment he felt not loss, but relief. The months of waiting were a time of quiet wonder. Slowly, drip by drip, warmth returned to his relationship with Chloe. She didn't say she'd forgiven him completely, but she allowed him to care for her. She allowed him to caress her belly and feel the baby's kicks. Sometimes she smiled at his clumsy attempts to assemble the crib. He watched the ice in her eyes gradually melt, giving way to cautious hope. And then the day came. Labor began early in the morning. Junhyuk spent the long hours by her side, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her forehead, whispering, "It's okay. You can do it." He saw her pain, her struggles, and his heart broke with love and helplessness. He, who was used to being in control, was powerless here and could only be there. And then a scream rang out, quiet, pure, demanding. The world stood still. The nurse placed the tiny, blanket-wrapped bundle in his arms. He froze. His entire being focused on that tiny face, those tiny fingers, that dark, wet hair. A girl. Something in his chest clicked loudly and burst open. He felt a surge of such all-consuming animal tenderness that it took his breath away. He was the strongest man in this room. He could protect her from anything, and the most vulnerable, because this one fragile life now held his entire heart, his entire soul, in its tiny fist. He looked up at Chloe. She lay there, exhausted but radiant. There was no longer a hint of resentment in her gaze. There was only love and weariness, mixed with boundless happiness. "Look how beautiful she is," Chloe whispered. Junhyuk nodded. He couldn't speak. He simply held his daughter to his chest, feeling her warm breath, and quiet, happy tears rolled down his cheeks. This was a miracle, a real one, the one he'd never allowed himself to hope for. And it was here, in his arms, his daughter. Months passed, quiet, filled with new concerns and new meaning. Junhyuk had completely withdrawn from all dubious affairs. His world was now limited to legitimate business, an expanded chain of cozy jazz cafes, a couple of successful restaurants, and a modest but reliable investment company. Mr. Kim, his right-hand man, was now the manager, not a shadowy assistant. They had clean, transparent reports and calm workdays. The dangers no longer hung over them like the sword of Damocles. The deal with the authorities had worked. His information had helped bring order to several dark areas, and his name, and most importantly, the names of his family, had remained strictly confidential. He exhaled. For the first time in many years, he slept peacefully, not waking at every rustle. One spring morning, as their daughter, whom they named Mira, snored peacefully in her stroller in the next room, Junhyuk took Chloe's hand. "Marry me," he said simply, not asking, simply stating a fact, as if it were the most logical and necessary conclusion to the whole journey. Chloe looked at him, and a familiar sparkle played in her eyes, laughter and a hint of mockery. "Is that an offer or an order, Mr. Lee?" "A request," he amended, the corners of his lips twitching into a smile. "The most important request of my life." They married quietly, without fanfare, not in a registry office or a huge church, but in a small private chapel outside the city. Only her closest friends were present, a couple of her artist friends, Mr. Kim and his wife, and of course Mira, whom Junhyuk himself carried into the ceremony, holding carefully in his arms like his most precious treasure. Chloe wore a simple cream dress, he a dark gray suit without a tie. They exchanged rings and glances that conveyed everything, the pain they had endured, forgiveness, and boundless gratitude for this rebirth. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Junhyuk kissed Claude, then gently touched his lips to the forehead of his sleeping daughter in his arms. At that moment, he caught his reflection in the window glass, and he didn't recognize himself. In the eyes he was used to seeing, cold and wary, there was now peace, a deep, quiet confidence. The darkness that had lived within them for decades finally retreated, giving way to light. He was no longer the boss, no longer the man in the shadows. He was simply Jun, husband, father. A year later, life had found its new perfect rhythm. Their apartment was no longer just a place to live, but a real home. Chloe's bright paintings and the clumsy children's drawings that Junhyuk carefully preserved hung on the walls. Stuffed toys littered the floor, and the air was perpetually filled with the scent of cookies and baby powder. One of those evenings, Chloe, settled in a chair with a book, watched them. Junhyuk slowly walked around the living room, rocking Mira in his arms. The girl, already big and strong, with eyes as dark as his and a stubborn tuft of hair, buried her nose in his neck, sucking on her fist. She was almost asleep, but every time he tried to put her in her crib, her eyelids immediately opened and she whimpered. And then he began pacing again, patiently, without a hint of irritation. He caught Chloe's gaze and smiled, a quiet, utterly happy smile. Then he returned to contemplating his daughter's face. In that moment, to the rhythmic sound of his own footsteps and the child's even breathing, a complete, unconditional understanding came to him. Everything that had come before, power, money, fear, struggle, even that old gnawing pain from the diagnosis, all of it was not real. A ghostly, unreal existence. But this is the weight of a warm, trusting little body in his arms. This is the soft light of a lamp falling on the pages of a book in his wife's hands. This is the silence of their safe home. This is real life, the only life that mattered. He walked to the window. The evening city glowed beyond the glass, but its lights no longer beckoned or frightened. They were simply a backdrop to his main performance, which was unfolding here, inside. The past was far behind him. It no longer had power over him. It was simply a memory, a lesson that had brought him here, to this moment, to this peace. Mira finally fell into a deep sleep. He stood there for a moment, afraid to disturb this fragile moment of perfection. Then he turned and carried her into the nursery. When he returned, he sat on the floor at Chloe's feet, hugged her knees, and rested his head on her thigh. She put the book down and ran her fingers through his hair. "Happy?" she asked quietly, already knowing the answer. He looked up at her, and there was nothing in them except pure, cloudless happiness and boundless gratitude. "Free," he replied, "and happy, finally." And that was the whole truth. The man who had worn shackles all his life, out of fear, out of pride, out of false beliefs, had finally thrown them off. He was free. To love, to be loved, to be simply a father, simply a husband, simply himself. And in that simplicity lay all his richness.